Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about entertainment and toxic masculinity versus toxic femininity. And the reason why I thought about doing this was because the release of the Marvels is coming up, and I'm sure there's going to be toxic femininity and discussion of toxic masculinity in that. So I decided I'd get ahead of the game and talk about the more relevant parts of it before I'll actually have to do a video on that. And right now, we live in a world where it is controlled by an ideology that says that women are perfect and saintly and men are the cause of all evil. That is to say, there's only toxic masculinity and women are toxic in no way whatsoever. This is the dominant principles of the quote unquote progressive ideology because it's one of the dominant principles within feminism itself. And that's one of the heavy strains within progressivism. But my point is that, yes, there is toxic masculinity. I will agree with that. One of the things that you can't do with quote unquote progressivism is assume that everything they say is wrong, because a good liar, and they're good liars, takes a little bit of truth and mixes it with falsehood so that that truth will cover up the mistakes within the falsehood. And that's what they do. There is such a thing as toxic masculinity. It's not what they say that it is, but there is such a thing as toxic femininity as well. And the problem right now is that we live in a society, again, where there is a combination of two fallacies. A combination of a false dilemma and hasty generalization, saying that there is only these two sides and one of them must be true, when really that's not the case. I would say both of them are true at the same time within our society right now. We live in the worst combination of toxic masculinity and toxic femininity at the same time. And it is destroying, it has destroyed really, the entertainment system as a whole, not to mention other things like the political system, the justice system, everything else. Because the principle of this kind of thinking that comes out of this toxicity, no matter which side that it's on, is stagnation. And stagnation kills creativity. But if you're looking for entertainment that's not based upon these ideological concerns, there are two links in the description and the pinned comment. They are my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, one Thomas Valiant and the other The Valiant Heroes. Both of them available for order at the Valiant Heroes Indiegogo site. They are about superheroes who are trying desperately to live according to true heroism in a world that's anything but heroic. And the other link is for my return to form for low fantasy, Crom the Destroyer, about an aging king who wants nothing more than to die an honorable death on the battlefield, but gets caught up in a situation where he then has to fight for his life desperately in order to maintain his honor. And these stories are based upon the traditional way of telling a story: merit, connection with your audience, giving them what they want, pure escapism. And you're looking at some of the beautiful art from those graphic novels in the background. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. But back to my topic. So I started thinking about this entire thing in a very roundabout way. I was listening to a video by Richard Meyer over at Comics Matter, and he was talking about the comic book industry. And if we wish to actually write the comic book industry, the only thing he thinks could do it right now is if you get 20 or 30 really well-known names that everybody in the comic world would know, and they would go back into Marvel or DC and say, yeah, we're going to take over now. And his argument is that it would work because all of these people, if they're well-known names, don't actually need these companies anymore. And so they could go in there and make demands. That is to say, they don't have anything being held over them. They're not controlled by the company anymore. So they could then exert the force of control themselves over the company and write the entire thing. And when I first heard Richard's argument, it actually sounded pretty sound to me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, yes, this would work, but this would work in a perfect world. And we don't live in a perfect world. Because the whole argument is based upon the fact that these companies don't control this group of hypothetical individuals, great comic pros, and therefore they can do this. But the point why they wouldn't do it to begin with is because they are so independent of these companies and of the other people that would be in this group as well, I would add. That independence ensures that they would never get together and form this group, which would then go through the entire hard process of writing the entire comic industry. It just won't happen. And it won't happen for the exact same reason why the comic industry and the rest of the entertainment industries don't produce good entertainment anymore. And it's all because of laziness. And oh, by the way, this is not just Richard saying this. I've heard many forms of this argument over many kinds of entertainment. People saying that if we could just get George Lucas to buy back Star Wars, and then he could write the entire thing and we would get good Star Wars entertainment again. Or you have Call Me Chato over on his channel, and I think really his channel is based upon the entire idea that if we got these good systems of entertainment back up and running, good television executives once again steering the ship, then we could get back to good television. But again, the point is, the reason why that doesn't happen is the exact same reason why we're in this mess to begin with. It's because people are lazy. It's because we don't live in a perfect world because human nature exists, the thing I'm always talking about. And that human nature is broken. And that brokenness leads to laziness. But honestly, that laziness is more a secondary symptom of the selfishness which that broken human nature tries to express all over the place. And that selfishness expresses itself within stagnation. And this is at the heart of both toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. Now, I've said this in the past. I agree. I believe that women and men are completely equal. But equal means balanced. It doesn't mean the same. You can have a balanced equation of 4 plus 1 equals 2 plus 3. It's a balanced and equal equation. Women are 4 plus 1. Men are 2 plus 3. So men and women are equal in dignity, but you then take that basic human nature, that unchangeable human nature, the dignity of every human being, and then you add our physical characteristics on top of that of being male or female, and it is expressed in what our lives are directed towards. And whether you want to accept it or not, women are directed towards, by their bodily functions, rearing children, and men are biologically driven towards conceiving and then fostering and providing protection for those same children. Or to put it another way, both men and women are geared towards creation and are given the tools within their respective place within the world to foster that creation. But if they misuse their natural talents and abilities, it leads to the destruction of creativity, which again is stagnation. For women, it's this drive that they have. It's called a nesting drive, where they have to make everything pretty and perfect. Why do women do this? Because they're basically a bird setting up a nest. They have a body which produces chemicals, which drives them towards wanting to physically produce children. And so they need to create a space where if this hypothetical child comes into being, they will then be safe and secure and have a safe and secure place to take care of them, because this is just really a mammalian drive. Since we are mammals and our children take so long to actually become independent, this is necessary and baked into our physical nature. And men have a drive to protect. Again, that drive to protect is part and parcel of this entire thing of creativity, of your hormones as a male pushing you towards procreation and then wanting to provide that self-same secure setting within which that procreated child will then be a successful heir to who you are. But if you take those natural drives and you remove them from what is basically reality, both physical reality that we live in and that our bodies exist within, which is what this ideology, this quote unquote progressive ideology in its utopian manner tries to do, then you remove the brakes which are put on the chemicals that drive us to do these things. And you get men becoming toxic in the way that they want power simply for power, and women where they want security simply for security. And that power expresses itself in dominance over others so that this position that they're in right now can never be changed. And this security for women becomes a smothering environment where, again, nothing is allowed to change. And I can hear someone thinking that, well, isn't progressivism all about change, all about novelty? I'm not talking about change in the definition of novelty. I'm talking about change in the definition of growth and creativity. I think those things are different, expressed just by the idea that if you actually have a child, yes, they're going to live basically the exact same life as you. There's nothing truly novel really going to happen in their lives, although you want to have it so that you don't smother those children because they need to be creative in their own way and live their own lives. See, there's a difference between novelty and creativity. And again, I think that difference is these people asking for novelty for the sake of novelty rather than creativity for the sake of the fulfillment of that same human nature. But anyways, I don't want to go too deep into that. The point is that we're talking about entertainment. And right now you have a quote unquote progressive led entertainment. And again, progressivism is fed by this feminist idea that women are always saints and men are always devils. And so it is the feminine way that you need to do everything. This is expressed in many of the videos that I covered, podcasts from Marvel, where they talk about the fact that only the feminine way to do things, to empower people, is the way to do things. Male power is competitive and destructive. Female power, in their estimation, is always creative and cooperative and is the only way to actually do things. When, quite honestly, it just smothers things to death. Which, again, I'm not going to say that the masculine way of extending power doesn't do the same thing, but it's just not the system we live under right now. And this is why we have entertainment, which is nothing more than a rehashing of old ideas, old stories, things that were done 20, 30, 40 years ago over and over again, where nothing new is actually created because they want stagnation. Because stagnation leads into this toxic feminine idea of security for the sake of security. And in the background of that is the toxic masculinity, which is power for the sake of power. So, why did I start talking about Richard and his video about the comic industry and these people coming in, these group of 20, 30, 40 greats that would take it over and right the ship, and why it doesn't work? Well, it doesn't work, again, as I said, because these ideas of power for the sake of power or security for the sake of security tend towards laziness. And this laziness takes hold when we reject the reality around us and think that we can control things beyond the natural flow of how reality and creation actually work. And this happens to almost everybody at some point in time. Go back to that line from Eye of the Tiger from the Rocky movies, where it says, "You trade your passion for glory." These comic greats and most of the people within the entertainment industry that have made it big, like George Lucas and the rest of them, they have traded their passion for glory a long time ago. Yes, they have the skills to actually right these ships, but they don't have the drive to actually get back into the mud and do all the things they needed to do to get to the position where they're in right now. Why would they go back and do that? They're already in a power position. They're already in a secure position. They don't need to go back and do that, so they never will go back and do that. Or if one or two of them are going to go back and do that, you're certainly not going to get 30 or 40. You're not going to get a big group of these people doing the exact same thing and pushing through all that needs to be done in order to get that creativity flowing again. Quite honestly, it takes a heroic nature of any human being to actually make sure that they stay in that position of passion. And quite honestly, without trying to toot my own horn, this is part of the reason why I live where I live right now. I live out in the boonies, in the backwoods of a backwater area within a larger backwater place for a very specific reason, or at the very least, one of the reasons. And it's because it's hard to live here. I actually think that is a plus. I have to struggle with a lot of things. The winter is not easy to get through. I usually typically lose my power for about 2 weeks every winter. That's not exactly ideal. And the summer has its own problems, to say the least. The bare minimum being I'm always fighting to push back the forest, as well as the critters, small and large, that come along with it that try to invade my house every summer. But really, that's the reason why I'm here. Why? Because it's hard. Why? Well, I think of it in these terms. You need a whetstone in order to sharpen a knife. You need something hard in order to keep that edge you need in order to keep your passion flowing. Not to say I'm the tip of the spear or the edge of the knife, but at the very least, I've placed myself in a position consciously so that if hard times come, and honestly, it looks like hard times are coming, descending upon us fairly quickly, then really, I don't care. This is one of the differences and one of the main problems with political ideology within the world today. It's city people versus country people a lot of the time. Country people live in a place which challenges them over and over again. City people want to live in the city because they don't want to deal with those challenges. And therefore, country people actually, in my estimation, have a much more in tune sense of common sense of how to deal with life and reality. Because, quite honestly, we live in a place where it doesn't matter how much power you have, there is no way that you can have enough security so that things become stagnant. Something is always pushing you off of that pedestal of it's good enough, I'm just going to stay here. You need to constantly be on your guard, constantly be in motion in order to actually make sure that you're not drowned by the things that just happen naturally. So let's bring that back to entertainment just for a second. Most people are looking at manga and saying, why is manga just trouncing North American comics and a lot of other comic related material, graphic novels, even YA novels, these kinds of things? Why? Because you see these guys who make manga, typically they not only do the art, but they also do the story, and they are killing themselves in order to make these things. They are literally working themselves to death, or at the very least, into an early grave. Some of them are doing this out of love for this medium. A lot of them are doing it because, well, in order to live, you need to work that hard. So they're in this position where they are constantly being overworked. They're constantly being driven to actually produce something faster and faster, more and more. And quite honestly, if you look at the history of the North American comic industry, you can see the exact same thing. Why were comics great within the 80s? Well, they were great because you had a system that was exactly the same. These guys back then were killing themselves. Or again, at the very least, they were driving themselves to an early grave. Over the last year, possibly 2 years now, I've been going over a lot of interviews with old comic pros. I concentrate on that kind of thing when I do my Wednesday live streams, by the way. And if you look at comic history, you will see this pattern play out over and over again. You have these creators, from Will Eisner and Jack Kirby to Sal Buscema and Barry Windsor Smith to Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane. Doesn't matter. You got all of these guys, and they all basically have the exact same story. Their story is they were driven by something in their life to actually be hungry. They needed money. Rob Liefeld had a father who had cancer. He had to pay for his medical bills. Todd McFarlane had a new wife, which he liked to show off to people, and he needed to provide for her and then for the daughter that they later had. Jim Shooter had to provide money to his family. Jack Kirby was constantly trying to scratch by. And these guys would work their fingers to the bone. And if you look at the height of the creativity of these creators, you will see that it comes at a time wherein they're still being driven by that original hunger that they had, but they have now are just on the cusp of, or have just passed that point wherein they have now become secure enough so that they don't have to work that way anymore. And then they make that slow descent into obscurity because they don't work that way anymore and they have lost their passion. And funny enough, the female flip side of this entire thing was something I just ran across as I was doing the research for last week's video, where I was going through the timelines of mostly female comic writers and listening to what they had to say and how they were expressing their frustrations with the industry. There was this strain of thinking that I kept on running across, which most of them would express. And it's the idea that what they wanted to do as writers was to write a story that was a blockbuster, something like an Alan Moore's Watchmen or a Frank Miller's Dark Knight, something like The Infinity Gauntlet. These large stories that they could just produce once, and therefore, from that greatness of that story, they would collect royalty checks over and over again for the rest of their life and just be secure, and maybe just writing something every once in a while as a lark. These, by the way, are the women who write a vast majority of the comic book stories right now, and I would say this type of thinking would also pervade other forms of entertainment. But the point being that within those old comic greats and within these new comic producers, the old ones typically being mostly male, the new ones being typically mostly female, the old comic greats melted into obscurity. They traded their passion for glory because they got to that point where they didn't need to fight anymore. They weren't hungry, and they just decided that the power that they had accumulated through their wealth was good in itself. It was power for the sake of power, not power for the sake of creativity. And definitely not power for the sake of maintaining the edge needed for that creativity. The same with the women. They want security. Nothing else than security. They want to write something which will make them secure for the rest of their entire lives so they never have to work again. So they're trying to use the creative process in order to stifle the creative process. And oh, by the way, both of them want to set up an industry that never changes, which again is a stifled industry that doesn't create, so that they can continue to collect royalties and accolades from something they did 20, 30, 40 years ago. And this again is why that idea of bringing back those greats will not work. Again, in a perfect world, it would work, where we had a perfect human nature, where we would create for the sake of creating, not because we are driven to create because we have to feed ourselves or create some kind of security for those around us. And there is a way to capture that lightning in a bottle, to make sure you're always hungry and therefore always being creative in this way. It's really the living out of a heroic life, which includes never resting on your laurels. But again, we don't live in a perfect world, and you're not going to get that many heroic people joining together to right this situation. You're just not going to get it in this imperfect world we live in. Certainly not for something like entertainment. Maybe for something political, for something like the Founding Fathers, they would be those group of heroic individuals that fought against tyranny. Yes, I would believe it is possible, and you see it throughout history, but only when really push comes to shove. And the only other time you see it in smaller venues, in something like entertainment, is when those people are hungry. Hungry for something that they cannot get justly otherwise. And that's the thing. These guys can justly get what they need to survive otherwise. So they're not going to rock that boat. They're just not. I think that Richard might see that they would do so. Think about it in that perfect world terms. Why? Because he actually has that drive. No matter what you think of his storytelling ability, you have to hand it to the man that at the very least he has drive. He's hungry. And so the future of any entertainment system right now is a future where people take risks. And you're only going to get that from a group of hungry people or hungry individuals. And they're not the people that are in control right now. Nor are they the great people who used to produce great comics or books or television or movies. You're not going to get it from them. It's like that study that they did one time looking at people who actually were successful and their classmates and seeing what was the key factor in that success. The key factor in that success they found through that study was not if you were rich or not, was not who you knew, was not your position in life, was not even how smart you are. It was who had the most drive. And I started off by talking about toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. Again, where does this play into the entire thing? Well, toxic masculinity and femininity both do the same thing. They kill that drive. They stifle any kind of creativity, any kind of growth. In, on the one hand, seeking either power for power's sake or security for security's sake. And the real problem that I see right now is the fact that, again, it has become this false dilemma within our society, where they say, well, either you have to be on the male side or the female side. And you see all these people making videos and articles and everything else, trying to own the other side one way or the other. And you could even extend that to the liberal versus conservative. It doesn't matter. That's a false dilemma. You don't have to pick one of those sides. If you pick one of those sides, you're actually contributing to the destruction in one way or another. It might be different than the destruction or the main points of destruction you see around you today, but you're still doing the same thing. Owning the other side is not about virtue. It's not about justice. It's not about creativity. It's about me extending power over you. One side extending power over the other. Tit for tat, one way or another. That's just playing the critical theory game. The criticism for criticism's sake. It doesn't have any constructive element to it. Because sure, I criticize, sure, I tear down, but always, always in the back, underlying my entire argument is, how can we make this thing better? How can we get back to something better? How can we construct something? How can we be creative? And those are the kind of people that actually will create something in the future, or are creating things now. People who put their heads down and say, sure, I'll deal with this and that and these gripes and these arguments, but I'm doing that as an extension of me trying to understand where the problems are. That's not going to be my main concentration. I'm going to put my head down and create. That's what the old sense of inspiration actually meant. You are inspired. The divine breath entered into you and allowed you to do what? The thing which the divine can do, which is create. And oh, by the way, it's not just a religious thing. You have people who are atheists, who believe in natural law. What do they base their argumentation around non-theistic natural law around? It is man's godlike ability to create. The ability to bring something into existence which did not exist before. So know that when you're talking about or listening to any of these discussions which try to push you into this false dilemma, that is nothing more than a pathway to stagnation. And the only thing that really has a future is that which understands and fosters the will, drive, ability, and reality of creating. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. It is my drive to create something entertaining with true heroes, dealing with ideas like honor and sacrifice. And so, if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.